Most recently, we saw the release of the latest Millie Bobby Brown Netflix film, The Electric State, which is a film adaptation of the graphic novel of the same name released in 2018. Coming into this thing, I had absolutely no knowledge of this at all. I'd never seen the actual book, and I'd never seen really much promotion for this movie whatsoever. On the surface of it, perhaps that should have raised some alarm bells, right? After all, this thing cost $320 million to make. What the hell? I suppose I get it with all the CGI they had to use, but at the same time, feels very ridiculous to make a film that expensive, then not give it a cinematic release, or all that much advertising. There's no chance that there'll ever be enough watch time on this thing, or enough of a subscriber shift, that would ever justify this film. Not at all. Of course, that's not a comment on the quality of the movie, just confusion about the strategy on display. Seriously, who's in charge of this decision? Like I said, I also just feel like they hardly advertised this thing at all. Did they think it was going to be a flop? Is this a tax write-off, so they didn't want to bother coughing up tens of millions of dollars on an advertising campaign? I do have to wonder how much they're going to end up losing at the end of the day. How can they possibly recoup all of these losses through streaming? At some point, I feel that perhaps Netflix needs to look into doing widespread cinematic releases for some of their big hitter films. And I know I can't seem to let it go, but it's just utterly absurd to me that we've seen a made-for-streaming movie with a budget this size. I know originally Universal was going to release it in cinemas, but Netflix then took on the project before it had filmed anything. So I'm shocked that such a CGI-heavy money muncher would have not gotten cancelled instantly when they saw the numbers. In this era of CEO and company greed, it's just so strange. There has to be some creative Hollywood accounting going on, right? They have to have cooked the books. No other explanation makes any real sense. Regardless, just the other day I sat down to watch it, and of course before I did so, I had to take a look at the Rotten Tomatoes score. Otherwise, how am I supposed to know if it's good or not? How am I supposed to know what I think? Whew! Now that is certainly a number. That has got to be the lowest score on Rotten Tomatoes I've seen in a very long time. The critical score is truly terrible, abysmally low, with a rotten 14% approval rating off of about 90 reviews. Plus, if you go online to see discussion in places like Reddit, I've only seen bad things. Lots of people are tearing down the film for various different reasons that we'll get into in a minute. I don't usually like to trust what critics say though, as for me, they often have opinions on films that feel very out of touch with the common man. Sometimes, I think they've forgotten that often movies are just meant to be fun, and they're to be enjoyed. Meanwhile, we have the audience score, which, from over 1,000 reviews, has an approval rating of 76% as of writing this. Which, whilst not setting the world on fire, would suggest that at the very least it's a decent film. A film that people enjoyed. I guess coming into it, I wasn't sure what to expect. What kind of film was I going to get? In the end though, I think I rather liked it. It was a good movie. Perhaps not the greatest of all time, but it was fun. For me, sometimes you just want the film to be fun. You don't want to feel like you've wasted your time on something boring. But what is the film about? Spoilers ahead. The Electric State follows Michelle Green, a young woman living in a dystopian version of the 1990s. Raised during a time of war between humanity and sentient robots who were trying to throw off their enslavement and get rights of their own within society, Michelle lived alongside her parents and younger brother Christopher, a child prodigy. At some point, the family were in a serious car crash, which seemingly left Christopher and his parents dead, and Michelle alone in foster care. During this time, humanity suddenly gained the capability to properly wage war and defeat the robots using special VR technology, which allowed humans to project their minds into drone bodies. The robots got smashed, and they were segregated into this containment zone in Arizona or something like that. Michelle got shuffled off into foster care, and her life started to really suck. Until one day, a robot version of her brother's favourite cartoon character, Cosmo, finds her and tells her that he's her brother, and that they need to get into the containment zone to find a doctor who can explain more. To do this, the two hitch a ride with a smuggler, John Keats, and his robotic partner, Herman. Once they arrive at the hideout, they're discovered by John, only for it to be revealed that the famed robot hunter, Marshall Bradbury, had followed them after a call about a robot from Michelle's foster parent. They have a bit of a skirmish, and the four end up in the exclusion zone with no way to escape except for finding the mysterious doctor. At this point, Bradbury links up with Ethan Skate, the billionaire CEO of Center, the company that developed the neurocasting technology and won the war. He's a man who seems to have become the oligarchic leader of the world, with the power to make binding treaties with the robots and also with his own private army. Skate's beginning to panic. As the main power source for the Neurocaster, which not only gives him the drone army but allows people to live out VR fantasies, is actually Christopher's mind. But since he's escaped into Cosmo and went to find Michelle, the system's starting to fail, which will tank the company. So he wants that robot returned. Our group of four eventually find their way to a robot sanctuary in the wilderness of the exclusion zone, which is governed by the one-time robot war leader, Mr. Peanut. While Peanut is initially not keen on them being there, as would be considered a violation of the treaty and could lead to the humans attacking them again, he eventually decides to help them so they'll leave faster. It all ends in disaster though. Michelle learns the truth about her brother and where he's located, but Senta manages to get his robot self back, and also massacres many of the robots that were there at the Oasis Mall Sanctuary. Regardless, the robots assemble an army and go to Senta with Michelle and John, and they fight the drone army whilst Michelle sneaks inside to save Chris. Chris, inside a neurocaster, tells her that if she frees him, he will die. But that's what he wants, because he's currently living a life of loneliness and isolation, unable to feel anything. So she turns it off, he dies, and the network crashes, allowing robots to return and the world to begin to change again. Oh, and it's hinted that Chris somehow projected his consciousness back into Cosmo before he died. So now, my thoughts on all of this. I think one of the biggest critiques I've seen has been in regards to the story, the narrative side of things. A huge wealth of the critics have lamented that this movie feels nothing like the source material, that it diverges completely from the graphic novel in favour of becoming a quip-heavy, action-adventure film instead of a somewhat haunting dystopian sci-fi. I did just Google a full rundown of the book plot because the Wikipedia blurb was very sparse indeed, and yeah, it feels very different in tone. I suppose if I had ever read the book before, then I would likely be amongst that chorus of disappointed and disgruntled fans who didn't get to see a beloved book get the adaptation they thought it deserved. The reality is, though, that I'm not part of that group. I haven't been in this fandom before, and so I can't judge it by that metric. I'm not saying it's wrong for people to think that a movie sucks because of this reason, and it's perfectly valid to believe that if you've read the book before and you know the actual story, but if not though, comes across as very performative outrage. I mean, hell, I knew that it was a film that was starring Chris Pratt and Millie Bobby Brown. I'm not saying they're bad actors or anything, just they seem to often appear in franchises that have a particular feel. I knew what I was getting into with this one from the get-go. I was expecting an action movie, and that's what I got as far as the story goes. Now, maybe I'm not even being fair to action movies. There are a lot of action films that have very good narratives. Some have terrible ones, though, that are carried by the action. And I'd say that this sits somewhere in the middle, leaning more towards being good than bad. It's not terrible by any stretch. It makes a lot of sense, and is rather clear all things considered. That being said, it did feel rather clumsy and haphazard at times. There were lots of scenes where there was just talking about very important events that will inform the direction of the story, but took place in the past. So that means a lot of character and narrative building are simply done through talking about exposition. Show, don't tell, is a core component of good filmmaking in my eyes, and this film sometimes struggles to do that. But not everything was bad. I did enjoy the relationship dynamics it formed. Those were probably the best parts of the movie. I liked the siblings and Herman and John and their strange friendship. I also thought the concept of the evil oligarch was very topical and very interesting, if a little bit overdone, and the idea of these sentient robots was exciting as well. I think in that regard, where it started to get a little bit clunky was the idea of robots being second-class citizens and the fight for their rights. At times you felt like it was a storyline that maybe belonged in a different type of movie. I feel like you either commit to this robot revolution to save their people, or you do the story with the brother trapped by the evil oligarch. You could still include robots in that story if you wanted, but I think it works better to commit to a single idea. Because they didn't, it felt like both sides of the equation came out of it feeling rather undercooked and like they didn't live up to their full potential. It seems to be a pretty common problem in this day and age, where filmmakers want so many different storylines and themes running throughout their work, when in the end, if they narrowed the focus down of the story they're trying to tell, it would work a whole lot better and make for a more cohesive story. Also, I felt like they'd zoom between some plot points rather rapidly. For instance, the Doctor in the desert. How is he there? Why has nobody noticed? Why is he easily able to get them out in the first place? They very much breezed past all of that and then give him a redemption death that was very half-baked. Because why should I care about this dude? We met him 5 minutes ago. In terms of the writing of the dialogue, I think that's where the narrative worked best. I know that people are kind of sick of quippy characters in the wake of the MCU, but I do think that this movie handled snarky dialogue very well. Plus, there were some good monologues, good speeches, as well as a lot of pathos in the final scenes with the siblings before the life support switched off. That being said though, whilst the story itself was middling I suppose, well, better than middling, but not setting the world on fire in any case, there were still a number of elements that I think the movie did very, very well. For starters, I think visually this film is very good. I mean, it cost a lot of money to make and you can tell from the end result. The robots looked incredible, absolutely incredible. I loved that so many of them had that wear and tear and also felt retro and nostalgic, like they were animatronics you'd seen before somewhere in your childhood that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The landscapes themselves felt very bleak and very dystopian, with my particular favourite being the mall that the robots have turned into their own city hall/sanctuary. It's just a gorgeous film. You can see why it cost over $300 million to make this. And it just cements my question, what were they thinking with a straight-to-streaming release? On top of that, the action itself, very bombastic, but at the same time, it wasn't ridiculously over the top and violent. I think perhaps only one human gets killed in the course of the movie, which is the doctor they go to find in the middle of the desert and discover in an old carnival. They save the gore for the robot-on-robot violence, and it works well. The score is really nothing I found all that memorable, to tell you the truth, but that's okay. Not everything needs a hugely memorable soundtrack. As for the acting, good across the board. You've got top-class actors like Stanley Tucci and Giancarlo Esposito putting in decent performances. Chris Pratt's playing the role that we all know him for these days, and Millie Bobby Brown is being a fairly compelling protagonist. Of course, the real stars, though, are the robots, who have the best performances across the board. My favourites being Woody Harrelson as Mr. Peanut and Anthony Mackie as Herman. But shout out to Cosmo, who despite having no real dialogue and just repeated voice clips again and again and again, was by far my favourite character in the movie. In the end, was the film the greatest? No. But was it as bad as everyone's saying? No. Sometimes you have a situation where a film adaptation will diverge from the source material and become absolute slop. This is not slop. A book fan may consider it such, compared to the book, but without those expectations, it was a lot of fun for a lazy evening on the couch. If I paid for a ticket, maybe I'd have a different thought about it, but for a streaming film, this was a bargain. Then again though, these have only been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of The Electric State if you've seen it? Did you like it? Hate it? If you haven't seen it, do you plan on it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.